Hostess, audiobook, by Isaac Asimov, read by Fred Major.
Hostess. Rose Smollett was happy about it, almost triumphant. She peeled off her gloves, put her hat away, and turned her brightening eyes upon her husband. She said, "Drake, we're going to have him here." Drake looked at her with annoyance. "You've missed supper. I thought you were going to be back by 7. "Oh, that doesn't matter. I ate something on the way home. But, Drake, we're going to have him here." "Who here?" "What are you talking about?" "The doctor from Hawkins' Planet. Didn't you realize that was what today's conference was about? We spent all day talking about it. It's the most exciting thing that could possibly have happened." Drake Smollett removed the pipe from the vicinity of his face. He stared first at it and then at his wife. "Let me get this straight. When you say the doctor from Hawkins' Planet, do you mean the Hawkinsite you've got at the Institute?" "Well, of course. Who else could I possibly mean?" "Then may I ask what the devil you mean by saying we'll have him here?" "Drake, don't you understand?" "What is there to understand? Your institute may be interested in the thing, but I'm not. What have we to do with it personally? It's institute business, isn't it?" "But, darling," Rose said patiently, "the Hawkinsite would like to stay at a private house somewhere where he won't be bothered with official ceremony, and where he'll be able to proceed more according to his own likes and dislikes. I find it quite understandable." "Why at our house?" "Because our place is convenient for the purpose, I suppose. They asked if I would allow it, and frankly," she added with some stiffness, "I consider it a privilege." "Look," Drake put his fingers through his brown hair and succeeded in rumpling it. "We've got a convenient little place here, granted. It's not the most elegant place in the world, but it does well enough for us. However, I don't see where we've got room for extraterrestrial visitors." Rose began to look worried. She removed her glasses and put them away in their case. "He can stay in the spare room. He'll take care of it himself. I've spoken to him, and he's very pleasant. Honestly, all we have to do is show a certain amount of adaptability." Drake said, "Sure. Just a little adaptability. The Hawkinsites breathe cyanide. We'll just adapt ourselves to that, I suppose." "He carries cyanide in a little cylinder. You won't even notice it." "And what else about them that I won't notice?" "Nothing else. They're perfectly harmless. Goodness, they're even vegetarians. And what does that mean? Do we feed him a bale of hay for dinner?" Rose's lower lip trembled. "Drake, you're being deliberately hateful. There are many vegetarians on Earth. They don't eat hay." "And what about us? Do we eat meat ourselves, or will that make us look like cannibals to him? I won't live on salads to suit him, I warn you." "You're being quite ridiculous." Rose felt helpless. She had married late in life, comparatively. Her career had been chosen. She herself had seemed well settled in it. She was a fellow in biology at the Jenkins Institute for the Natural Sciences, with over 20 publications to her credit. In a word, the line was hewed, the path cleared. She had been set for a career in spinsterhood, and now at 35 she was still a little amazed to find herself a bride of less than a year. Occasionally it embarrassed her, too, since she sometimes found that she had not the slightest idea of how to handle her husband. What did one do when a man of the family became mulish? That was not included in any of her courses. As a woman of independent mind and career, she couldn't bring herself to cajolery. So she looked at him steadily and said simply, "It means very much to me." "Why?" "Because, Drake, if he stays here for any length of time, I can study him really closely. Very little work has been done on the biology and psychology of the individual Hawkinsite or of any of the extraterrestrial intelligences. We have some of their sociology and history, of course, but that's all. Surely you must see the opportunity. He stays here. We watch him, speak to him, observe his habits." "Not interested." "Oh, Drake, I don't understand you." "You're going to say I'm not usually like this, I suppose." "Well, you're not." Drake was silent for a while. He seemed withdrawn, and his high cheekbones and large chin were twisted and frozen into a brooding position. He said finally, "Look, I've heard a bit about the Hawkinsites in the way of my own business. You say there have been investigations of their sociology, but not of their biology." "Sure. It's because the Hawkinsites don't like to be studied as specimens any more than we would. I've spoken to men who were in charge of security groups watching various Hawkinsite missions on Earth. The missions stay in the rooms assigned to them, and don't leave for anything but the most important official business. They have nothing to do with Earthmen. It's quite obvious that they are as revolted by us as I personally am by them. In fact, I just don't understand why this Hawkinsite at the Institute should be any different. It seems to me to be against all the rules to have him come here by himself anyway, and to have him want to stay in an Earthman's home just puts the maraschino cherry on top. Rose said wearily, "This is different. I'm surprised you can't understand it, Drake. He's a doctor. He's coming here in the way of medical research. And I'll grant you that he probably doesn't enjoy staying with human beings and will find us perfectly horrible. But he must stay just the same. Do you suppose human doctors enjoy going into the tropics, or that they are particularly fond of letting themselves be bitten by infected mosquitoes?" Drake said sharply, "What's this about mosquitoes? What have they to do with it?" "Why, nothing," Rose answered, surprised. "It just came to my mind, that's all. I was thinking of Reed and his yellow fever experiments." Drake shrugged. "Well, have it your own way." For a moment Rose hesitated. "You're not angry about this, are you?" To her own ears she sounded unpleasantly girlish. No. And that, Rose knew, meant that he was. Rose surveyed herself doubtfully in the full-length mirror. She had never been beautiful and was quite reconciled to the fact, so much so that it no longer mattered. Certainly it would not matter to a being from Hawkins' planet. What did bother her was this matter of being a hostess under the very queer circumstances of having to be tactful to an extraterrestrial creature and at the same time to her husband as well. She wondered which would prove the more difficult. Drake was coming home late that day. He was not due for half an hour. Rose found herself inclined to believe that he had arranged that purposely in a sullen desire to leave her alone with her problem. She found herself in a state of mild resentment. He had called her just before noon at the Institute and had asked abruptly, "When are you taking him home?" She answered curtly, "In about 3 hours." "All right. What's his name, his Hawkinsite name?" "Why do you want to know?" She could not keep the chill from her words. "Let's call it a small investigation of my own. After all, the thing will be in my house." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Drake, don't bring your job home with you." Drake's voice sounded tinny and nasty in her ears. "Why not, Rose? Isn't that exactly what you're doing?" It was, of course, so she gave him the information he wanted. This was the first time in their married life that they had had even the semblance of a quarrel, and as she sat there before the full-length mirror, she began to wonder if perhaps she ought not make an attempt to see his side of it. In essence, she had married a policeman. Of course, he was more than simply a policeman. He was a member of the World Security Board. It had been a surprise to her friends. The fact of the marriage itself had been the biggest surprise, but if she had decided on marriage, the attitude was, why not with another biologist? Or if she had wanted to go afield, an anthropologist, perhaps, even a chemist. But why, of all people, a policeman? Nobody had exactly said those things, naturally, but it had been in the very atmosphere at the time of her marriage. She had resented it then and ever since. A man could marry whom he chose, but if a doctor of philosophy, female variety, chose to marry a man who never went past the bachelor's degree, there was shock. Why should there be? What business was it of theirs? He was handsome in a way, intelligent in another way, and she was perfectly satisfied with her choice. Yet how much of this same snobbishness did she bring home with her? Didn't she always have the attitude that her own work, her biological investigations, were important, while his job was merely something to be kept within the four walls of his little office in the old UN buildings on the East River? She jumped up from her seat in agitation and, with a deep breath, decided to leave such thoughts behind her. She desperately did not want to quarrel with him, and she just wasn't going to interfere with him. She was committed to accepting the Hawkinsite as guest, but otherwise she would let Drake have his own way. He was making enough of a concession as it was. Harg Tholen was standing quietly in the middle of the living room when she came down the stairs. He was not sitting, since he was not anatomically constructed to sit. He stood on two sets of limbs placed close together, while a third pair, entirely different in construction, were suspended from a region that would have been the upper chest in a human being. The skin of his body was hard, glistening, and ridged, while his face bore a distant resemblance to something alienly bovine. Yet he was not completely repulsive, and he wore clothes of a sort over the lower portion of his body in order to avoid offending the sensibilities of his human hosts. He said, "Mrs. Smollett, I appreciate your hospitality beyond my ability to express it in your language." and he drooped so that his forelimbs touched the ground for a moment. Rose knew this to be a gesture signifying gratitude among the beings of Hawkins' planet. She was grateful that he spoke English as well as he did. The construction of his mouth, combined with an absence of incisors, gave a whistling sound to the sibilants. Aside from that, he might have been born on Earth for all the accent his speech showed. She said, "My husband will be home soon, and then we will eat." "Your husband?" For a moment he said nothing more, and then added, "Yes, of course." She let it go. If there was one source of infinite confusion among the 5 intelligent races of the known galaxy, it lay in the differences among them with regard to their sex life and the social institutions that grew around it. The concept of husband and wife, for instance, existed only on Earth. The other races could achieve a sort of intellectual understanding of what it meant, but never an emotional one. She said, "I have consulted the Institute in preparing your menu. I trust you will find nothing in it that will upset you." The Hawkinsite blinked its eyes rapidly. Rose recalled this to be a gesture of amusement. He said, "Proteins are proteins, my dear Mrs. Smollett. For those trace factors which I need but are not supplied in your food, I have brought concentrates that will be most adequate." And proteins were proteins. Rose knew this to be true. Her concern for the creature's diet had been largely one of formal politeness. In the discovery of life on the planets of the outer stars, one of the most interesting generalizations that had developed was the fact that although life could be formed on the basis of substances other than proteins, even on elements other than carbon, it remained true that the only known intelligences were proteinaceous in nature. This meant that each of the 5 forms of intelligent life could maintain themselves over prolonged periods on the food of any of the other 4. She heard Drake's key in the door and went stiff with apprehension. She had to admit he did well. He strode in and without hesitation thrust his hand out at the Hawkinsite, saying firmly, "Good evening, Dr. Tholen." The Hawkinsite put out his large and rather clumsy forelimb, and the two, so to speak, shook hands. Rose had already gone through that procedure and knew the queer feeling of a Hawkinsite hand in her own. It had felt rough and hot and dry. She imagined that to the Hawkinsite her own and Drake's felt cold and slimy. At the time of the formal greeting she had taken the opportunity to observe the alien hand. It was an excellent case of converging evolution. Its morphological development was entirely different from that of the human hand, yet it had brought itself into a fairly approximate similarity. There were 4 fingers, but no thumb. Each finger had 5 independent ball and socket joints. In this way, the flexibility lost with the absence of the thumb was made up for by the almost tentacular properties of the fingers. What was even more interesting to her biologist's eyes was the fact that each Hawkinsite finger ended in a vestigial hoof, very small and, to the layman, unidentifiable as such, but clearly adapted at one time to running, just as man's had been to climbing. Drake said, in friendly enough fashion, "Are you quite comfortable, sir?" The Hawkinsite answered, "Quite. Your wife has been most thoughtful in all her arrangements." "Would you care for a drink?" The Hawkinsite did not answer, but looked at Rose with a slight facial contortion that indicated some emotion which, unfortunately, Rose could not interpret. She said nervously, "On Earth, there is the custom of drinking liquids which have been fortified with ethyl alcohol. We find it stimulating." "Oh, yes. I am afraid, then, that I must decline. Ethyl alcohol would interfere most unpleasantly with my metabolism." "Why, so it does to Earthmen, too, but I understand, Dr. Tholen," Drake replied. "Would you object to my drinking?" "Of course not." Drake passed close to Rose on his way to the sideboard, and she caught only one word. He said, "God," in a tightly controlled whisper, yet he managed to put 17 exclamation points after it. The Hawkinsite stood at the table. His fingers were models of dexterity as they wove their way around the cutlery. Rose tried not to look at him as he ate. His wide, lipless mouth split his face alarmingly as he ingested food, and in chewing his large jaws moved disconcertingly from side to side. It was another evidence of his ungulate ancestry. Rose found herself wondering if, in the quiet of his own room, he would later chew his cud, and was then panic-stricken lest Drake get the same idea and leave the table in disgust. But Drake was taking everything quite calmly. He said, "I imagine, Dr. Tholen, that the cylinder at your side holds cyanide?" Rose started. She had actually not noticed it. It was a curved metal object, something like a water canteen, that fitted flatly against the creature's skin, half hidden behind its clothing. But then Drake had a policeman's eyes. The Hawkinsite was not in the least disconcerted. "Quite so," he said, and his hoofed fingers held out a thin, flexible hose that ran up his body, its tint blending into that of his yellowish skin, and entered the corner of his wide mouth. Rose felt slightly embarrassed, as though at the display of intimate articles of clothing. Drake said, "And does it contain pure cyanide?" The Hawkinsite humorously blinked his eyes. "I hope you are not considering possible danger to Earthites. I know the gas is highly poisonous to you, and I do not need a great deal. The gas contained in the cylinder is 5% hydrogen cyanide, the remainder oxygen. None of it emerges except when I actually suck at the tube, and that need not be done frequently." "I see. And you really must have the gas to live?" Rose was slightly appalled. One simply did not ask such questions without careful preparation. It was impossible to foresee where the sensitive points of an alien psychology might be. And Drake must be doing this deliberately, since he could not help realizing that he could get answers to such questions as easily from herself. Or was it that he preferred not to ask her? The Hawkinsite remained apparently unperturbed. "Are you not a biologist, Mr. Smollett?" "No, Dr. Tholen." "But you are in close association with Mrs. Dr. Smollett?" Drake smiled a bit. "Yes, I am married to a Mrs. Doctor, but just the same, I am not a biologist, merely a minor government official. My wife's friends," he added, "call me a policeman." Rose bit the inside of her cheek. In this case, it was the Hawkinsite who had impinged upon the sensitive point of an alien psychology. On Hawkins' planet there was a tight caste system, and intercaste associations were limited, but Drake wouldn't realize that. The Hawkinsite turned to her. "May I have your permission, Mrs. Smollett, to explain a little of our biochemistry to your husband? It will be dull for you, since I am sure you must understand it quite well already." She said, "By all means do, Dr. Tholen." He said, "You see, Mr. Smollett, the respiratory system in your body and in the bodies of all air-breathing creatures on Earth is controlled by certain metal-containing enzymes, I am taught. The metal is usually iron, though sometimes it is copper. In either case, small traces of cyanide would combine with these metals and immobilize the respiratory system of the terrestrial living cell. They would be prevented from using oxygen and killed in a few minutes. The life on my own planet is not quite so constituted. The key respiratory compounds contain neither iron nor copper, no metal at all, in fact. It is for this reason that my blood is colorless. Our compounds contain certain organic groupings which are essential to life, and these groupings can only be maintained intact in the presence of a small concentration of cyanide. Undoubtedly, this type of protein has developed through millions of years of evolution on a world which has a few tenths of a % of hydrogen cyanide occurring naturally in the atmosphere. Its presence is maintained by a biological cycle. Various of our native microorganisms liberate the free gas." "You make it extremely clear, Dr. Tholen, and very interesting," Drake said. "What happens if you don't breathe it? Do you just go like that?" He snapped his fingers. "Not quite. It isn't equivalent to the presence of cyanide for you. In my case, the absence of cyanide would be equivalent to slow strangulation. It happens sometimes in ill-ventilated rooms on my world that the cyanide is gradually consumed and falls below the minimum necessary concentration. The results are very painful and difficult to treat." Rose had to give Drake credit. He really sounded interested, and the alien, thank heaven, did not mind the catechism. The rest of the dinner passed without incident. It was almost pleasant. Throughout the evening, Drake remained that way, interested, even more than that, absorbed. He drowned her out, and she was glad of it. He was the one who was really colorful, and it was only her job, her specialized training, that stole the color from him. She looked at him gloomily and thought, why did he marry me? Drake sat, one leg crossed over the other, hands clasped and tapping his chin gently, watching the Hawkinsite intently. The Hawkinsite faced him, standing in his quadruped fashion. Drake said, I find it difficult to keep thinking of you as a doctor. The Hawkinsite laughingly blinked his eyes. I understand what you mean, he said. I find it difficult to think of you as a policeman. On my world, policemen are very specialized and distinctive people. Are they? Said Drake somewhat dryly, and then changed the subject. I gather that you are not here on a pleasure trip. No. I am here very much on business. I intend to study this queer planet you call Earth, as it has never been studied before by any of my people. Queer? Asked Drake. In what way? The Hawkinsite looked at Rose. Does he know of the inhibition death? Rose felt embarrassed. His work is important, she said. I am afraid that my husband has little time to listen to the details of my work. She knew that this was not really adequate, and she felt herself to be the recipient yet again of one of the Hawkinsite's unreadable emotions. The extraterrestrial creature turned back to Drake. It is always amazing to me to find how little you Earthmen understand your own unusual characteristics. Look, there are 5 intelligent races in the galaxy. These have all developed independently, yet have managed to converge in remarkable fashion. It is as though, in the long run, intelligence requires a certain physical make-up to flourish. I leave that question for philosophers, but I need not belabor the point, since it must be a familiar one to you. Now, when the differences among the intelligences are closely investigated, it is found over and over again that it is you Earthmen, more than any of the others, who are unique. For instance, it is only on Earth that life depends upon metal enzymes for respiration. Your people are the only ones which find hydrogen cyanide poisonous. Yours is the only form of intelligent life which is carnivorous. Yours is the only form of life which has not developed from a grazing animal. And most interesting of all, yours is the only form of intelligent life known which stops growing upon reaching maturity. Drake grinned at him. Rose felt her heart suddenly race. It was the nicest thing about him, that grin, and he was using it perfectly naturally. It wasn't forced or false. He was adjusting to the presence of this alien creature. He was being pleasant, and he must be doing it for her. She loved that thought and repeated it to herself. He was doing it for her. He was being nice to the Hawkinsite for her sake. Drake was saying with his grin, You don't look very large, Dr. Tholen. I should say that you are an inch taller than I am, which would make you 6 feet 2 inches tall. Is it that you are young, or is it that the others on your world are generally small? Neither, said the Hawkinsite. We grow at a diminishing rate with the years, so that at my age it would take 15 years to grow an additional inch, but, and this is the important point, we never entirely stop, and of course, as a consequence, we never entirely die. Drake gasped, and even Rose felt herself sitting stiffly upright. This was something new. This was something which, to her knowledge, the few expeditions to Hawkins' planet had never brought back. She was torn with excitement, but held an exclamation back and let Drake speak for her. He said, They don't entirely die. You're not trying to say, sir, that the people on Hawkins' planet are immortal? No people are truly immortal. If there were no other way to die, there would always be accident, and if that fails, there is boredom. Few of us live more than several centuries of your time. Still, it is unpleasant to think that death may come involuntarily. It is something which to us is extremely horrible. It bothers me even as I think of it now, this thought that against my will, and despite all care, death may come. We, said Drake grimly, are quite used to it. You Earthmen live with the thought. We do not. And this is why we are disturbed to find that the incidence of inhibition death has been increasing in recent years. You have not yet explained, said Drake, just what the inhibition death is, but let me guess. Is the inhibition death a pathological cessation of growth? Exactly. And how long after growth cessation does death follow? Within the year. It is a wasting disease, a tragic one, and absolutely incurable. What causes it? The Hawkinsite paused a long time before answering, and even then there was something strained and uneasy about the way he spoke. Mr. Smollett, we know nothing about the cause of the disease. Drake nodded thoughtfully. Rose was following the conversation as though she were a spectator at a tennis match. Drake said, And why do you come to Earth to study this disease? Because, again, Earthmen are unique. They are the only intelligent beings who are immune. The inhibition death affects all the other races. Do your biologists know that, Mrs. Smollett? He had addressed her suddenly, so that she jumped slightly. She said, No, they don't. I am not surprised. That piece of information is the result of very recent research. The inhibition death is easily diagnosed incorrectly, and the incidence is much lower on the other planets. In fact, it is a strange thing, something to philosophize over, that the incidence of the death is highest on my world, which is closest to Earth, and lower on each more distant planet, so that it is lowest on the world of the star Tempera, which is farthest from Earth, while Earth itself is immune. Somewhere in the biochemistry of the Earthite there is the secret of that immunity. How interesting it would be to find it, Drake said. But look here, you can't say Earth is immune. From where I sit, it looks as if the incidence is 100%. All Earthmen stop growing and all Earthmen die. We've all got the inhibition death. Not at all. Earthmen live up to 70 years after the cessation of growth. That is not the death as we know it. Your equivalent disease is rather one of unrestrained growth. Cancer, you call it. But come, I bore you. Rose protested instantly. Drake did likewise with even more vehemence, but the Hawkinsite determinedly changed the subject. It was then that Rose had her first pang of suspicion, for Drake circled Harg Tholen warily with his words, worrying him, jabbing at him, attempting always to get the information back to the point where the Hawkinsite had left off. Not badly, not unskillfully, but Rose knew him and could tell what he was after. And what could he be after but that which was demanded by his profession? And as though in response to her thoughts, the Hawkinsite took up the phrase which had begun careening in her mind like a broken record on a perpetual turntable. He asked, Did you not say you were a policeman? Drake said curtly, Yes. Then there is something I would like to request you to do for me. I have been wanting to all this evening since I discovered your profession, and yet I hesitate. I do not wish to be troublesome to my host and hostess. We'll do what we can. I have a profound curiosity as to how Earthmen live, a curiosity which is not perhaps shared by the generality of my countrymen. So I wonder, could you show me through one of the police departments on your planet? I do not belong to a police department in exactly the way you imagine, said Drake cautiously. However, I am known to the New York Police Department. I can manage it without trouble tomorrow. That would be most convenient for me. Would I be able to visit the Missing Persons Bureau? The what? The Hawkinsite drew his 4 standing legs closer together, as if he were becoming more intense. It is a hobby of mine, a little queer corner of interest I have always had. I understand you have a group of police officers whose sole duty it is to search for men who are missing. And women and children, added Drake. But why should that interest you so particularly? Because, there again you are unique. There is no such thing as a missing person on our planet. I can't explain the mechanism to you, of course, but among the people of other worlds there is always an awareness of one another's presence, especially if there is a strong, affectionate tie. We are always aware of each other's exact location, no matter where on the planet we might be. Rose grew excited again. The scientific expeditions to Hawkins' planet had always had the greatest difficulty in penetrating the internal emotional mechanisms of the natives. And here was one who talked freely, who would explain. She forgot to worry about Drake and intruded into the conversation. "Can you feel such awareness even now on Earth?" The Hawkinsite said, "You mean across space? No, I'm afraid not. But you see the importance of the matter. All the uniqueness of Earth should be linked. If the lack of this sense can be explained, perhaps the immunity to inhibition death can be also. Besides, it strikes me as very curious that any form of intelligent community life can be built among people who lack this community awareness. How can an Earthman tell, for instance, when he has formed a congenial subgroup, a family? How can you two, for instance, know that there is a true tie between you?" Rose found herself nodding. How strongly she missed such a sense. But Drake only smiled. "We have our ways. It is as difficult to explain what we call love to you as it is for you to explain your sense to us." "I suppose so. Yet tell me truthfully, Mr. Smollett, if Mrs. Smollett were to leave this room and enter another without your having seen her do so, would you really not be aware of her location?" "I really would not," the Hawkinsite said. "Amazing." He hesitated, then added, "Please do not be offended at the fact that I find it revolting as well." After the light in the bedroom had been put out, Rose went to the door 3 times, opening it a crack and peering out. She could feel Drake watching her. There was a hard kind of amusement in his voice as he asked, finally, "What's the matter?" She said, "I want to talk to you." "Are you afraid our friend can hear?" Rose was whispering. She got into bed and put her head on his pillow so that she could whisper better. She said, "Why were you talking about the inhibition death to Dr. Tholen?" "I am taking an interest in your work, Rose. You've always wanted me to take an interest." "I'd rather you weren't sarcastic." She was almost violent, as nearly violent as she could be in a whisper. "I know that there's something of your own interest in this, of police interest, probably. What is it?" He said, "I'll talk to you tomorrow." "No, right now." He put his hand under her head, lifting it. For a wild moment she thought he was going to kiss her, just kiss her on impulse, the way husbands sometimes did, or as she imagined they sometimes did. Drake never did, and he didn't now. He merely held her close and whispered, "Why are you so interested?" His hand was almost brutally hard upon the nape of her neck, so that she stiffened and tried to draw back. Her voice was more than a whisper now. "Stop it, Drake," he said. "I want no questions from you and no interference. You do your job, and I'll do mine." "The nature of my job is open and known." "The nature of my job," he retorted, "isn't, by definition. But I'll tell you this. Our 6-legged friend is here in this house for some definite reason. You weren't picked as biologist in charge for any random reason. Do you know that 2 days ago he'd been inquiring about me at the commission?" "You're joking." "Don't believe that for a minute. There are depths to this that you know nothing about. But that's my job, and I won't discuss it with you any further. Do you understand?" "No, but I won't question you if you don't want me to." "Then go to sleep." She lay stiffly on her back, and the minutes passed, and then the quarter hours. She was trying to fit the pieces together, even with what Drake had told her. The curves and colors refused to blend. She wondered what Drake would say if he knew she had a recording of that night's conversation. One picture remained clear in her mind at that moment. It hovered over her mockingly. The Hawkinsite at the end of the long evening had turned to her and said gravely, "Good night, Mrs. Smollett. You are a most charming hostess." She had desperately wanted to giggle at the time. How could he call her a charming hostess? To him, she could only be a horror, a monstrosity with too few limbs and a too narrow face. And then, as the Hawkinsite delivered himself of this completely meaningless piece of politeness, Drake had turned white. For one instant, his eyes had burned with something that looked like terror. She had never before known Drake to show fear of anything, and the picture of that instant of pure panic remained with her until all her thoughts finally sagged into the oblivion of sleep. It was noon before Rose was at her desk the next day. She had deliberately waited until Drake and the Hawkinsite had left, since only then was she able to remove the small recorder that had been behind Drake's armchair the previous evening. She had had no original intention of keeping its presence secret from him. It was just that he had come home so late, and she couldn't say anything about it with the Hawkinsite present. Later on, of course, things had changed. The placing of the recorder had been only a routine maneuver. The Hawkinsite's statements and intonations needed to be preserved for future intensive studies by various specialists at the Institute. It had been hidden in order to avoid the distortions of self-consciousness that the visibility of such a device would bring, and now it couldn't be shown to the members of the Institute at all. It would have to serve a different function altogether, a rather nasty function. She was going to spy on Drake. She touched the little box with her fingers and wondered, irrelevantly, how Drake was going to manage that day. Social intercourse between inhabited worlds was, even now, not so commonplace that the sight of a Hawkinsite on the city streets would not succeed in drawing crowds, but Drake would manage, she knew. Drake always managed. She listened once again to the sounds of last evening, repeating the interesting moments. She was dissatisfied with what Drake had told her. Why should the Hawkinsite have been interested in the two of them particularly? Yet Drake wouldn't lie. She would have liked to check with the Security Commission, but she knew she could not do that. Besides, the thought made her feel disloyal. Drake would definitely not lie. But then again, why should Harg Tholen not have investigated them? He might have inquired similarly about the families of all the biologists at the Institute. It would be no more than natural to attempt to choose the home he would find most pleasant by his own standards, whatever they were. And if he had, even if he had investigated only the Smollets, why should that create the great change in Drake from intense hostility to intense interest? Drake undoubtedly had knowledge he was keeping to himself. Only heaven knew how much. Her thoughts churned slowly through the possibilities of interstellar intrigue. So far, to be sure, there were no signs of hostility or ill-feeling among any of the 5 intelligent races known to inhabit the galaxy. As yet, they were spaced at intervals too wide for enmity. Even the barest contact among them was all but impossible. Economic and political interests just had no point at which to conflict. But that was only her idea, and she was not a member of the Security Commission. If there were conflict, if there were danger, if there were any reason to suspect that the mission of a Hawkinsite might be other than peaceful, Drake would know. Yet was Drake sufficiently high in the councils of the Security Commission to know offhand the dangers involved in the visit of a Hawkinsite physician? She had never thought of his position as more than that of a very minor functionary in the Commission. He had never presented himself as more, and yet might he be more? She shrugged at the thought. It was reminiscent of 20th century spy novels and of costume dramas of the days when there existed such things as atom bomb secrets. The thought of costume dramas decided her. Unlike Drake, she wasn't a real policeman, and she didn't know how a real policeman would go about it. But she knew how such things were done in the old dramas. She drew a piece of paper toward her and, with a quick motion, slashed a vertical pencil mark down its center. She headed one column, Harg Tholen, the other Drake. Under Harg Tholen she wrote, bona fide, and thoughtfully put 3 question marks after it. After all, was he a doctor at all? Or was he what could only be described as an interstellar agent? What proof had even the Institute of his profession except his own statements? Was that why Drake had quizzed him so relentlessly concerning the inhibition death? Had he boned up in advance and tried to catch the Hawkinsite in an error? For a moment she was irresolute. Then, springing to her feet, she folded the paper, put it in the pocket of her short jacket, and swept out of her office. She said nothing to any of those she passed as she left the Institute. She left no word at the reception desk as to where she was going or when she would be back. Once outside, she hurried into the 3rd-level tube and waited for an empty compartment to pass. The 2 minutes that elapsed seemed unbearably long. It was all she could do to say New York Academy of Medicine into the mouthpiece just above the seat. The door of the little cubicle closed, and the sound of the air flowing past the compartment hissed upward in pitch. The New York Academy of Medicine had been enlarged both vertically and horizontally in the past 2 decades. The library alone occupied one entire wing of the 3rd floor. Undoubtedly, if all the books, pamphlets, and periodicals it contained were in their original printed form rather than in microfilm, the entire building, huge though it was, would not have been sufficiently vast to hold them. As it was, Rose knew there was already talk of limiting printed works to the last 5 years rather than to the last 10, as was now the case. Rose, as a member of the Academy, had free entry to the library. She hurried toward the alcoves devoted to extraterrestrial medicine and was relieved to find them unoccupied. It might have been wiser to have enlisted the aid of a librarian, but she chose not to. The thinner and smaller the trail she left, the less likely it was that Drake might pick it up. And so, without guidance, she was satisfied to travel along the shelves, following the titles anxiously with her fingers. The books were almost all in English, though some were in German or Russian. None, ironically enough, were in extraterrestrial symbolisms. There was a room somewhere for such originals, but they were available only to official translators. Her traveling eye and finger stopped. She had found what she was looking for. She dragged 6 volumes from the shelf and spread them out upon the small dark table. She fumbled for the light switch and opened the first of the volumes. It was entitled Studies on Inhibition. She leafed through it and then turned to the author index. The name of Harg Tholen was there. One by one she looked up the references indicated, then returned to the shelves for translations of such original papers as she could find. She spent more than 2 hours in the Academy. When she was finished, she knew this much. There was a Hawkinsite doctor named Harg Tholen who was an expert on the inhibition death. He was connected with the Hawkinsite research organization with which the Institute had been in correspondence. Of course, the Harg Tholen she knew might simply be impersonating an actual doctor to make the role more realistic. But why should that be necessary? She took the paper out of her pocket, and where she had written bona fide with 3 question marks, she now wrote a yes in capitals. She went back to the Institute, and at 4 p.m. was once again at her desk. She called the switchboard to say that she would not answer any phone calls, and then she locked her door. Underneath the column headed Harg Tholen, she now wrote 2 questions. Why did Harg Tholen come to Earth alone? She left considerable space. Then, what is his interest in the Missing Persons Bureau? Certainly the inhibition death was all the Hawkinsite said it was. From her reading at the Academy, it was obvious that it occupied the major share of medical effort on Hawkins' planet. It was more feared there than cancer was on Earth. If they had thought the answer to it lay on Earth, the Hawkinsites would have sent a full-scale expedition. Was it distrust and suspicion on their part that made them send only 1 investigator? What was it Harg Tholen had said the night before? The incidence of the death was highest upon his own world, which was closest to Earth, lowest upon the world farthest from Earth. Add to that the fact implied by the Hawkinsite and verified by her own readings at the Academy that the incidence had expanded enormously since interstellar contact had been made with Earth. Slowly and reluctantly she came to one conclusion. The inhabitants of Hawkins' planet might have decided that somehow Earth had discovered the cause of the inhibition death and was deliberately fostering it among the alien peoples of the galaxy, with the intention, perhaps, of becoming supreme among the stars. She rejected this conclusion with what was almost panic. It could not be. It was impossible. In the first place, Earth wouldn't do such a horrible thing. Secondly, it couldn't. As far as scientific advance was concerned, the beings of Hawkins' planet were certainly the equals of Earthmen. The death had occurred there for thousands of years, and their medical record was one of total failure. Surely Earth, in its long-distance investigations into alien biochemistry, could not have succeeded so quickly. In fact, as far as she knew, there were no investigations to speak of into Hawkinsite pathology on the part of Earth biologists and physicians. Yet all the evidence indicated that Harg Tholen had come in suspicion and had been received in suspicion. Carefully she wrote down under the question, why did Harg Tholen come to Earth alone? The answer, Hawkins' planet believes Earth is causing the inhibition death. But then, what was this business about the Bureau of Missing Persons? As a scientist, she was rigorous about the theories she developed. All the facts had to fit in, not merely some of them. Missing Persons Bureau. If it was a false trail, deliberately intended to deceive Drake, it had been done clumsily, since it came only after an hour of discussion of the inhibition death. Was it intended as an opportunity to study Drake, If so, why? Was this perhaps the major point? The Hawkinsite had investigated Drake before coming to them. Had he come because Drake was a policeman with entry to bureaus of missing persons? But why? Why? She gave it up and turned to the column headed Drake. And there a question wrote itself, not in pen and ink upon the paper, but in the much more visible letters of thought on mind. Why did he marry me? Thought Rose, and she covered her eyes with her hands so that the unfriendly light was excluded. They had met quite by accident somewhat more than a year before, when he had moved into the apartment house in which she then lived. Polite greetings had somehow become friendly conversation, and this, in turn, had led to occasional dinners in a neighborhood restaurant. It had been very friendly and normal, and an exciting new experience, and she had fallen in love. When he asked her to marry him, she was pleased and overwhelmed. At the time, she had many explanations for it. He appreciated her intelligence and friendliness. She was a nice girl. She would make a good wife, a splendid companion. She had tried all those explanations and had half believed every one of them, but half belief was not enough. It was not that she had any definite fault to find in Drake as a husband. He was always thoughtful, kind, and a gentleman. Their married life was not one of passion, and yet it suited the paler emotional surges of the late 30s. She wasn't 19. What did she expect? That was it. She wasn't 19. She wasn't beautiful or charming or glamorous. What did she expect? Could she have expected Drake, handsome and rugged, whose interest in intellectual pursuits was quite minor, who neither asked about her work in all the months of their marriage, nor offered to discuss his own with her? Why, then, did he marry her? But there was no answer to that question, and it had nothing to do with what Rose was trying to do now. It was extraneous, she told herself fiercely. It was a childish distraction from the task she had set herself. She was acting like a girl of 19, after all, with no chronological excuse for it. She found that the point of her pencil had somehow broken, and took a new one. In the column headed Drake, she wrote, "Why is he suspicious of Harg Tholen?" And under it she put an arrow pointing to the other column. What she had already written there was sufficient explanation. If Earth was spreading the inhibition death, or if Earth knew it was suspected of such a deed, then obviously it would be preparing for eventual retaliation on the part of the aliens. In fact, the setting would actually be one of preliminary maneuvering for the first interstellar war of history. It was an adequate but horrible explanation. Now there was left the second question, the one she could not answer. She wrote it slowly. Why Drake's reaction to Tholen's words, "You are a most charming hostess"? She tried to bring back the exact setting. The Hawkinsite had said it innocuously, matter-of-factly, politely, and Drake had frozen at the sound of it. Over and over she had listened to that particular passage in the recording. An Earthman might have said it in just such an inconsequential tone on leaving a routine cocktail party. The recording did not carry the sight of Drake's face. She had only her memory for that. Drake's eyes had become alive with fear and hate, and Drake was one who feared practically nothing. What was there to fear in the phrase, "You are a most charming hostess," that could upset him so? Jealousy? Absurd. The feeling that Tholen had been sarcastic? Maybe, though unlikely. She was sure Tholen was sincere. She gave it up and put a large question mark under that second question. There were two of them now, one under Harg Tholen and one under Drake. Could there be a connection between Tholen's interest in missing persons and Drake's reaction to a polite party phrase? She could think of none. She put her head down upon her arms. It was getting dark in the office, and she was very tired. For a while, she must have hovered in that queer land between waking and sleeping, when thoughts and phrases lose the control of the conscious and disport themselves erratically and surrealistically through one's head. But no matter where they danced and leaped, they always returned to that one phrase, "You are a most charming hostess." Sometimes she heard it in Harg Tholen's cultured, lifeless voice, and sometimes in Drake's vibrant one. When Drake said it, it was full of love, full of a love she never heard from him. She liked to hear him say it. She startled herself to wakefulness. It was quite dark in the office now, and she put on the desk light. She blinked, then frowned a little. Another thought must have come to her in that fitful half-sleep. There had been another phrase which had upset Drake. What was it? Her forehead furrowed with mental effort. It had not been last evening. It was not anything in the recorded conversation, so it must have been before that. Nothing came, and she grew restless. Looking at her watch, she gasped. It was almost 8. They would be at home waiting for her. But she did not want to go home. She did not want to face them. Slowly she took up the paper upon which she had scrawled her thoughts of the afternoon, tore it into little pieces, and let them flutter into the little atomic flash ashtray upon her desk. They were gone in a little flare, and nothing was left of them. If only nothing were left of the thoughts they represented as well. There was no use. She would have to go home. They were not there waiting for her, after all. She came upon them getting out of a gyrocab just as she emerged from the tubes onto street level. The gyrocabby, wide-eyed, gazed after his fares for a moment, then hovered upward and away. By unspoken mutual consent, the three waited until they had entered the apartment before speaking. Rose said disinterestedly, "I hope you've had a pleasant day, Dr. Tholen." "Quite. And a fascinating and profitable one as well, I think." "Have you had a chance to eat?" Though Rose had not herself eaten, she was anything but hungry. "Yes, indeed." Drake interrupted. "We had lunch and supper sent up to us sandwiches." He sounded tired. Rose said, "Hello, Drake." It was the first time she had addressed him. Drake scarcely looked at her. "Hello." The Hawkinsite said, "Your tomatoes are remarkable vegetables. We have nothing to compare with them in taste on our own planet. I believe I ate 2 dozen, as well as an entire bottle of tomato derivative." "Ketchup," explained Drake briefly. Rose said, "And your visit at the Missing Persons Bureau, Dr. Tholen? You say you found it profitable?" "I should say so, yes." Rose kept her back to him. She plumped up sofa cushions as she said, "In what way?" "I find it most interesting that the large majority of missing persons are males. Wives frequently report missing husbands, while the reverse is practically never the case." Rose said, "Oh, that's not mysterious, Dr. Tholen. You simply don't realize the economic setup we have on Earth. On this planet, you see, it is the male who is usually the member of the family that maintains it as an economic unit. He is the one whose labor is repaid in units of currency. The wife's function is generally that of taking care of home and children." "Surely this is not universal?" Drake put in, "More or less. If you're thinking of my wife, she is an example of the minority of women who are capable of making their own way in the world." Rose looked at him swiftly. Was he being sarcastic? The Hawkinsite said, "Your implication, Mrs. Smollett, is that women, being economically dependent upon their male companions, find it less feasible to disappear?" "That's a gentle way of putting it," said Rose, "but that's about it." "And would you call the Missing Persons Bureau of New York a fair sampling of such cases in the planet at large?" "Why, I should think so," the Hawkinsite said abruptly. "And is there, then, an economic explanation for the fact that since interstellar travel has been developed, the percentage of young males among the missing is more pronounced than ever?" It was Drake who answered with a verbal snap. "Good Lord, that's even less of a mystery than the other. Nowadays the runaway has all space to disappear into. Anyone who wants to get away from trouble need only hop the nearest space freighter. They're always looking for crewmen, no questions asked. And it would be almost impossible to locate the runaway after that, if he really wanted to stay out of circulation." "And almost always young men in their first year of marriage." Rose laughed suddenly. She said, "Why, that's just the time a man's troubles seem the greatest. If he survives the first year, there is usually no need to disappear at all." Drake was obviously not amused. Rose thought again that he looked tired and unhappy. Why did he insist on bearing the load alone? And then she thought that perhaps he had to. The Hawkinsite said suddenly, "Would it offend you if I disconnected for a period of time?" Rose said, "Not at all. I hope you haven't had too exhausting a day. Since you come from a planet whose gravity is greater than that of Earth's, I'm afraid we too easily presume that you would show greater endurance than we do." "Oh, I am not tired in a physical sense." He looked for a moment at her legs and blinked very rapidly, indicating amusement. "You know, I keep expecting Earthmen to fall either forward or backward in view of their meager equipment of standing limbs. You must pardon me if my comment is over-familiar, but your mention of the lesser gravity of Earth brought it to my mind. On my planet, 2 legs would simply not be enough, but this is all beside the point at the moment. It is just that I have been absorbing so many new and unusual concepts that I feel the desire for a little disconnection." Rose shrugged inwardly. Well, that was as close as one race could get to another anyway. As nearly as the expeditions to Hawkins' planet could make out, Hawkinsites had the faculty for disconnecting their conscious mind from all its bodily functions and allowing it to sink into an undisturbed meditative process for periods of time lasting up to terrestrial days. Hawkinsites found the process pleasant, even necessary sometimes, though no Earthman could truly say what function it served. Conversely, it had never been entirely possible for Earthmen to explain the concept of sleep to a Hawkinsite, or to any extraterrestrial. What an Earthman would call sleep or a dream, a Hawkinsite would view as an alarming sign of mental disintegration. Rose thought uneasily. Here's another way Earthmen are unique. The Hawkinsite was backing away, drooping so that his forelimbs swept the floor in polite farewell. Drake nodded curtly at him as he disappeared behind the bend in the corridor. They heard his door open, close, then silence. After minutes in which the silence was thick between them, Drake's chair creaked as he shifted restlessly. With a mild horror, Rose noticed blood upon his lips. She thought to herself, "He's in some kind of trouble. I've got to talk to him. I can't let it go on like this." She said, "Drake." Drake seemed to look at her from a far, far distance. Slowly his eyes focused closer at hand, and he said, "What is it? Are you through for the day, too?" "No. I'm ready to begin. It's the tomorrow you spoke of." "Aren't you going to speak to me?" "Pardon me?" "Last night you said you would speak to me tomorrow. I am ready now." Drake frowned. His eyes withdrew beneath a lowered brow, and Rose felt some of her resolution begin to leave her. He said, "I thought it was agreed that you would not question me about my business in this matter." "I think it's too late for that. I know too much about your business by now." "What do you mean?" he shouted, jumping to his feet. Recollecting himself, he approached, laid his hands upon her shoulders, and repeated in a lower voice, "What do you mean?" Rose kept her eyes upon her hands, which rested limply in her lap. She bore the painfully gripping fingers patiently and said slowly, "Dr. Tholen thinks that Earth is spreading the inhibition death purposely. That's it, isn't it?" She waited. Slowly the grip relaxed, and he was standing there, hands at his side, face baffled and unhappy. He said, "Where did you get that notion?" "It's true, isn't it?" He said breathlessly, unnaturally, "I want to know exactly why you say that. Don't play foolish games with me, Rose. This is for keeps." "If I tell you, will you answer one question?" "What question?" "Is Earth spreading the disease deliberately, Drake?" Drake flung his hands upward. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" He knelt before her. He took her hands in his, and she could feel their trembling. He was forcing his voice into soothing, loving syllables. He was saying, "Rose, dear, look. You've got something red-hot by the tail, and you think you can use it to tease me in a little husband-wife repartee. No, I'm not asking much. Just tell me exactly what causes you to say what you have just said." He was terribly earnest about it. "I was at the New York Academy of Medicine this afternoon. I did some reading there. But why? What made you do it?" "You seemed so interested in the inhibition death, for one thing, and Dr. Tholen made those statements about the incidence increasing since interstellar travel and being the highest on the planet nearest Earth." She paused. "And your reading?" he prompted. "What about your reading, Rose?" She said, "It backs him up. All I could do was to skim hastily into the direction of their research in recent decades. It seems obvious to me, though, that at least some of the Hawkinsites are considering the possibility the inhibition death originates on Earth." "Do they say so outright?" "No. Or if they have, I haven't seen it." She gazed at him in surprise. "In a matter like this, certainly the government would have investigated Hawkinsite research on the matter," she said gently. Don't you know about Hawkinsite research in the matter, Drake? The government... Never mind about that. Drake had moved away from her, and now he turned again. His eyes were bright. He said, as though making a wonderful discovery, "Why, you're an expert in this." Was she? Did he find that out only now that he needed her? Her nostrils flared, and she said flatly, "I'm a biologist." He said, "Yes, I know that. But I mean your particular specialty is growth. Didn't you once tell me you had done work on growth?" "You might call it that. I've had 20 papers published on the relationship of nucleic acid, fine structure, and embryonic development on my Cancer Society grant." "Good. I should have thought of that." He was choked with a new excitement. "Tell me, Rose. Look, I'm sorry if I lost my temper with you a moment ago. You'd be as competent as anyone to understand the direction of their researches if you read about it, wouldn't you?" "Fairly competent, yes." "Then tell me how they think the disease is spread. The details, I mean." "Oh, now look, that's asking a little too much. I spent a few hours in the academy, that's all. I'd need much more time than that to be able to answer your question." "An intelligent guess, at least. You can't imagine how important it is," she said doubtfully. "Of course, Studies on Inhibition is a major treatise in the field. It would summarize all of the available research data." "Yes? And how recent is it?" "It's one of those periodic things. The last volume is about a year old." "Does it have any account of his work in it?" His finger jabbed in the direction of Harg Tholen's bedroom. "More than anyone else's. He's an outstanding worker in the field. I looked over his papers especially." "And what are his theories about the origin of the disease? Try to remember, Rose." She shook her head at him. "I could swear he blames Earth, but he admits they know nothing about how the disease is spread. I could swear to that, too." He stood stiffly before her. His strong hands were clenched into fists at his side, and his words were scarcely more than a mutter. "It could be a matter of complete overestimation. Who knows?" He whirled away. "I'll find out about this right now, Rose. Thank you for your help." She ran after him. "What are you going to do?" "Ask him a few questions." He was rummaging through the drawers of his desk, and now his right hand withdrew. It held a needle gun. She cried, "No, Drake!" He shook her off roughly and turned down the corridor toward the Hawkinsite's bedroom. Drake threw the door open and entered. Rose was at his heels, still trying to grasp his arm, but now he stopped and looked at Harg Tholen. The Hawkinsite was standing there motionless, eyes unfocused, his 4 standing limbs sprawled out in 4 directions, as far as they would go. Rose felt ashamed of intruding, as though she were violating an intimate right, but Drake, apparently unconcerned, walked to within 4 feet of the creature and stood there. They were face to face, Drake holding the needle gun easily at a level of about the center of the Hawkinsite's torso. Drake said, "Now keep quiet. He'll gradually become aware of me." "How do you know?" The answer was flat. "I know. Now get out of here." But she did not move, and Drake was too absorbed to pay her further attention. Portions of the skin on the Hawkinsite's face were beginning to quiver slightly. It was rather repulsive, and Rose found herself preferring not to watch. Drake, suddenly. "That's about all, Dr. Tholen. Don't throw in connection with any of the limbs. Your sense organs and voice box will be quite enough." The Hawkinsite's voice was dim. "Why do you invade my disconnection chamber?" Then more strongly. "And why are you armed?" His head wobbled slightly atop a still frozen torso. He had apparently followed Drake's suggestion against limb connection. Rose wondered how Drake knew such partial reconnection to be possible. She herself had not known of it. The Hawkinsite spoke again. "What do you want?" And this time Drake answered. He said, "The answer to certain questions." "With a gun in your hand? I would not humor your discourtesy so far. You would not merely be humoring me. You might be saving your own life. That would be a matter of considerable indifference to me under the circumstances. I am sorry, Mr. Smollett, that the duties toward a guest are so badly understood on Earth." "You are no guest of mine, Dr. Tholen," said Drake. "You entered my house on false pretenses. You had some reason for it, some way you had planned of using me to further your own purposes. I have no compunction in reversing the process." "You had better shoot. It will save time." "You are convinced that you will answer no questions? That in itself is suspicious. It seems that you consider certain answers to be more important than your life." "I consider the principles of courtesy to be very important. You, as an Earthman, may not understand. Perhaps not. But I, as an Earthman, understand one thing. Drake had jumped forward faster than Rose could cry out, faster than the Hawkinsite could connect his limbs. When he sprang backward, the flexible hose of Harg Tholin's cyanide cylinder was in his hand. At the corner of the Hawkinsite's wide mouth, where the hose had once been affixed, a droplet of colorless liquid oozed sluggishly from a break in the rough skin and slowly solidified into a brown, jelly-like globule as it oxidized. Drake yanked at the hose and the cylinder jerked free. He plunged home the knob that controlled the needle valve at the head of the cylinder, and the small hissings ceased. "I doubt," said Drake, "that enough will have escaped to endanger us. I hope, however, that you realize what will happen to you now if you do not answer the questions I am going to ask you, and answer them in such a way that I am convinced you are being truthful." "Give me back my cylinder," said the Hawkinsite slowly. "If not, it will be necessary for me to attack you, and then it will be necessary for you to kill me." Drake stepped back. "Not at all. Attack me, and I shoot your legs from under you. You will lose them. All four, if necessary. But you will still live in a horrible way. You will live to die of cyanide lack. It would be a most uncomfortable death. I am only an Earthman, and I can't appreciate its true horrors, but you can, can't you?" The Hawkinsite's mouth was open, and something within quivered yellow-green. Rose wanted to throw up. She wanted to scream, "Give him back the cylinder, Drake!" But nothing would come. She couldn't even turn her head. Drake said, "You have about an hour, I think, before the effects are irreversible. Talk quickly, Dr. Tholin, and you will have your cylinder back." "And after that?" said the Hawkinsite. "After that, what does it matter to you? Even if I kill you then, it will be a clean death, not cyanide lack." Something seemed to pass out of the Hawkinsite. His voice grew guttural, and his words blurred as though he no longer had the energy to keep his English perfect. He said, "What are your questions?" And as he spoke, his eyes followed the cylinder in Drake's hand. Drake swung it deliberately, tantalizingly, and the creature's eyes followed. Drake said, "What are your theories concerning the inhibition death? Why did you really come to Earth? What is your interest in the Missing Persons Bureau?" Rose found herself waiting in breathless anxiety. These were the questions she would like to have asked, too. Not in this manner, perhaps, but in Drake's job, kindness and humanity had to take second place to necessity. She repeated that to herself several times in an effort to counteract the fact that she found herself loathing Drake for what he was doing to Dr. Tholin. The Hawkinsite said, "The proper answer would take more than the hour I have left me. You have bitterly shamed me by forcing me to talk under duress. On my own planet, you could not have done so under any circumstances. It is only here, on this revolting planet, that I can be deprived of cyanide." "You are wasting your hour, Dr. Tholin." "I would have told you this eventually, Mr. Smollett. I needed your help. It is why I came here." "You are still not answering my questions." "I will answer them now. For years, in addition to my regular scientific work, I have been privately investigating the cells of my patients suffering from inhibition death. I have been forced to use the utmost secrecy and to work without assistance, since the methods I used to investigate the bodies of my patients were frowned upon by my people. Your society would have similar feelings against human vivisection, for instance. For this reason, I could not present the results I obtained to my fellow physicians until I had verified my theories here on Earth." "What were your theories?" demanded Drake. The feverishness had returned to his eyes. "It became more and more obvious to me as I proceeded with my studies that the entire direction of research into the inhibition death was wrong. Physically, there was no solution to its mystery. The inhibition death is entirely a disease of the mind." Rose interrupted. "Surely, Dr. Tholin, it isn't psychosomatic." A thin, grey, translucent film had passed over the Hawkinsite's eyes. He no longer looked at them. He said, "No, Mrs. Smollett, it is not psychosomatic. It is a true disease of the mind, a mental infection. My patients had double minds. Beyond and beneath the one that obviously belonged to them, there was evidence of another one, an alien mind. I worked with inhibition death patients of other races than my own, and the same could be found. In short, there are not 5 intelligences in the galaxy, but 6. And the 6th is parasitic. Rose said, "This is wild, impossible. You must be mistaken, Dr. Tholen." "I am not mistaken. Until I came to Earth, I thought I might be, but my stay at the Institute and my researches at the Missing Persons Bureau convinced me that is not so." "What is so impossible about the concept of a parasitic intelligence? Intelligences like these would not leave fossil remains, nor even leave artifacts, if their only function is to derive nourishment somehow from the mental activities of other creatures. One can imagine such a parasite, through the course of millions of years perhaps, losing all portions of its physical being but that which remains necessary, just as a tapeworm among your earthly physical parasites eventually lost all its functions but the single one of reproduction. In the case of the parasitic intelligence, all physical attributes would eventually be lost. It would become nothing but pure mind, living in some mental fashion we cannot conceive of on the minds of others, particularly on the minds of Earthmen." Rose said, "Why particularly Earthmen?" Drake simply stood apart, intent, asking no further questions. He was content, apparently, to let the Hawkinsite speak. "Have you not surmised that the 6th intelligence is a native of Earth? Mankind from the beginning has lived with it, has adapted to it, is unconscious of it. It is why the higher species of terrestrial animals, including man, do not grow after maturity and eventually die, what is called natural death. It is the result of this universal parasitic infestation. It is why you sleep and dream, since it is then that the parasitic mind must feed, and then that you are a little more conscious of it, perhaps. It is why the terrestrial mind alone of the intelligences is so subject to instability. Where else in the galaxy are found split personalities and other such manifestations? After all, even now there must be occasional human minds which are visibly harmed by the presence of the parasite. Somehow these parasitic minds could traverse space. They had no physical limitations. They could drift between the stars in what would correspond to a state of hibernation. Why the first ones did it, I don't know. Probably no one will ever know. But once those first discovered the presence of intelligence on other planets in the galaxy, there was a small, steady stream of parasitic intelligences making their way through space. We of the outer worlds must have been a gourmet's dish for them, or they would have never struggled so hard to get to us. I imagine many must have failed to make the trip, but it must have been worth the effort to those who succeeded. But you see, we of the other worlds had not lived with these parasites for millions of years as man and his ancestors had. We had not adapted ourselves to it. Our weak strains had not been killed off gradually through hundreds of generations, until only the resistance were left. So where Earthmen could survive the infection for decades with little harm, we others die a quick death within a year. And is that why the incidence has increased since interstellar travel between Earth and the other planets has begun? Yes. For a moment there was silence, and then the Hawkinsite said, with a sudden access of energy, "Give me back my cylinder. You have your answer." Drake said coolly, "What about the Missing Persons Bureau?" He was swinging the cylinder again, but now the Hawkinsite did not follow its movements. The gray, translucent film on his eyes had deepened, and Rose wondered whether that was simply an expression of weariness or an example of the changes induced by cyanide lack. The Hawkinsite said, "As we are not well adapted to the intelligence that infests man, neither is it well adapted to us. It can live on us, it even prefers to, apparently, but it cannot reproduce with ourselves alone as the source of its life. The inhibition DAP is therefore not directly contagious among our people." Rose looked at him with growing horror. "What are you implying, Dr. Tholen?" "The Earthman remains the prime host for the parasite. An Earthman may infect one of us if he remains among us, but the parasite, once it is located in an intelligence of the outer worlds, must somehow return to an Earthman if it expects to reproduce. Before interstellar travel, this was possible only by a repassage of space, and therefore the incidence of infection remained infinitesimal. Now, We are infected and reinfected as the parasites return to Earth and come back to us via the mind of Earthmen who travel through space. Rose said faintly, "And the missing persons are the intermediate hosts. The exact process by which it is done I, of course, do not know. The masculine terrestrial mind seems better suited for their purposes. You remember that at the Institute I was told that the life expectancy of the average human male is 3 years less than that of the average female. Once reproduction has been taken care of, the infested male leaves by spaceship for the outer worlds. He disappears." "But this is impossible," insisted Rose. "What you say implies that the parasite mind can control the actions of its host. This cannot be, or we of Earth would have noticed their presence." "The control, Mrs. Smollett, may be very subtle and may, moreover, be exerted only during the period of active reproduction. I simply point to your Missing Persons Bureau. Why do the young men disappear? You have economic and psychological explanations, but they are not sufficient. But I am quite ill now and cannot speak much longer. I have only this to say. In the mental parasite, your people and mine have a common enemy. Earthmen, too, need not die involuntarily except for its presence. I thought that if I found myself unable to return to my own world with my information because of the unorthodox methods I used to obtain it, I might bring it to the authorities on Earth and ask their help in stamping out this menace. Imagine my pleasure when I found that the husband of one of the biologists at the Institute was a member of one of Earth's most important investigating bodies. Naturally, I did what I could to be made a guest at his home in order that I might deal with him privately, convince him of the terrible truth, utilize his position to help in the attack on the parasites. This is, of course, now impossible. I cannot blame you too far. As Earthman, you cannot be expected to understand the psychology of my people. Nevertheless, you must understand this. I can have no further dealing with either of you. I could not even bear to remain any longer on Earth." Drake said, "Then you alone of all your people have any knowledge of this theory of yours?" "I alone." Drake held out the cylinder. "Your cyanide, Dr. Tholen." The Hawkinsite groped for it eagerly. His supple fingers manipulated the hose and the needle valve with the utmost delicacy. In the space of 10 seconds he had it in place and was inhaling the gas in huge breaths. His eyes were growing clear and transparent. Drake waited until the Hawkinsite breathings had subsided to normal. And then, without expression, he raised his needle gun and fired. Rose screamed. The Hawkinsite remained standing. His 4 lower limbs were incapable of buckling, but his head lolled, and from his suddenly flaccid mouth the cyanide hose fell, disregarded. Once again Drake closed the needle valve, and now he tossed the cylinder aside and stood there somberly looking at the dead creature. There was no external mark to show that he had been killed. The needle gun's pellet, thinner than the needle which gave the gun its name, entered the body noiselessly and easily, and exploded with devastating effect only within the abdominal cavity. Rose ran from the room, still screaming. Drake pursued her, seized her arm. She heard the hard, flat sounds of his palm against her face without feeling them, and subsided into little bubbling sobs. Drake said, "I told you to have nothing to do with this. Now what do you think you'll do?" She said, "Let me go. I want to leave. I want to go away." "Because of something it was my job to do? You heard what the creature was saying. Do you suppose I could allow him to return to his world and spread those lies? They would believe him. And what do you think would happen then? Can you imagine what an interstellar war might be like? They would imagine they would have to kill us all to stop the disease." With an effort that seemed to turn her inside out, Rose steadied. She looked firmly into Drake's eyes and said, "What Dr. Tholen said were no lies and no mistakes, Drake." "Oh, come now, you're hysterical. You need sleep." "I know what he said is so because the Security Commission knows all about that same theory and knows it to be true." "Why do you say such a preposterous thing?" "Because you yourself let that slip twice." Drake said, "Sit down." She did so, and he stood there looking curiously at her. "So I've given myself away twice, have I? You've had a busy day of detection, my dear. You have facets you keep well hidden." He sat down and crossed his legs. Rose thought, yes, she had had a busy day. She could see the electric clock on the kitchen wall from where she sat. It was more than 2 hours past midnight. Hogtholen had entered their house 35 hours before, and now he lay murdered in the spare bedroom. Drake said, "Well, aren't you going to tell me where I pulled my 2 boners?" You turned white when Hogtholen referred to me as a charming hostess. Hostess has a double meaning, you know, Drake. A host is one who harbors a parasite. "Number 1, said Drake. "What's number 2? "That's something you did before Hogtholen entered the house. I've been trying to remember it for hours. Do you remember, Drake? You spoke about how unpleasant it was for Hawkinsites to associate with Earthmen, and I said Hogtholen was a doctor and had to. I asked you if you thought that human doctors particularly enjoyed going to the tropics or letting infected mosquitoes bite them. Do you remember how upset you became?" Drake laughed. "I had no idea I was so transparent. Mosquitoes are hosts for the malaria and yellow fever parasites." He sighed. "I've done my best to keep you out of this. I tried to keep the Hawkinsite away. I tried threatening you. Now there's nothing left but to tell you the truth. I must, because only the truth or death will keep you quiet, and I don't want to kill you." She shrank back in her chair, eyes wide. Drake said, "The Commission knows the truth. It does us no good. We can only do all in our power to prevent the other worlds from finding out." "But the truth can't be held down forever. Hogtholen found out. You've killed him, but another extraterrestrial will repeat the same discovery over and over again. You can't kill them all." "We know that too," agreed Drake. "We have no choice." "Why?" cried Rose. "Hogtholen gave you the solution. He made no suggestions or threats of war between worlds. He suggested that we combine with the other intelligences and help to wipe out the parasite, and we can. If we, in common with all the others, put every scrap of effort into it." "You mean we can trust him? Does he speak for his government or for the other races? Can we dare to refuse the risk?" Drake said, "You don't understand." He reached toward her and took one of her cold, unresisting hands between both of his. He went on, "I may seem silly trying to teach you anything about your specialty, but I want you to hear me out. Hogtholen was right. Man and his prehistoric ancestors have been living with this parasitic intelligence for uncounted ages. Certainly for a much longer period than we have been truly Homo sapiens. In that interval, we have not only become adapted to it, we have become dependent upon it. It is no longer a case of parasitism. It is a case of mutual cooperation. You biologists have a name for it." She tore her hand away. "What are you talking about, symbiosis?" "Exactly. We have a disease of our own, remember? It is a reverse disease, one of unrestrained growth. We've mentioned it already as a contrast to the inhibition death. Well, what is the cause of cancer? How long have biologists, physiologists, biochemists, and all the others been working on it? How much success have they had with it? Why? Can't you answer that for yourself now?" She said slowly, "No, I can't. What are you talking about?" "It's all very well to say that if we could remove the parasite, we would have eternal growth and life if we wanted it, or at least until we got tired of being too big or of living too long, and did away with ourselves neatly. But how many millions of years has it been since the human body has had occasion to grow in such an unrestrained fashion? Can it do so any longer? Is the chemistry of the body adjusted to that? Has it got the proper whatchamacallits?" "Enzymes," Rose supplied in a whisper. "Yes, enzymes. It's impossible for us. If for any reason the parasitic intelligence, as Hogtholen calls it, does leave the human body, or if its relationship to the human mind is in any way impaired, growth does take place, but not in any orderly fashion. We call the growth cancer, and there you have it. There's no way of getting rid of the parasite. We're together for all eternity. To get rid of their inhibition death, extraterrestrials must first wipe out all vertebrate life on Earth. There is no other solution for them, and so we must keep knowledge of it from them. Do you understand?" Her mouth was dry, and it was difficult to talk. "I understand, Drake." She noticed that his forehead was damp and that there was a line of perspiration down each cheek. "And now you'll have to get it out of the apartment. It's late at night, and I'll be able to get the body out of the building. From there on?" He turned to her. "I don't know when I'll be back." "I understand, Drake," she said again. Hargtholen was heavy. Drake had to drag him through the apartment. Rose turned away, retching. She hid her eyes until she heard the front door close. She whispered to herself, "I understand, Drake." It was 3 a.m. Nearly an hour had passed since she had heard the front door click gently into place behind Drake and his burden. She didn't know where he was going, what he intended doing. She sat there numbly. There was no desire to sleep, no desire to move. She kept her mind traveling in tight circles, away from the things she knew and which she wanted not to know. Parasitic minds. Was it only a coincidence? Or was it some queer racial memory, some tenuous, long-sustained wisp of tradition or insight stretching back through incredible millennia that kept current the odd myth of human beginnings? She thought to herself, there were two intelligences on Earth to begin with. There were humans in the Garden of Eden, and also the serpent, which was more subtle than any beast of the field. The serpent infected man, and as a result, it lost its limbs. Its physical attributes were no longer necessary, and because of the infection, man was driven out of the garden of eternal life. Death entered the world. Yet despite her efforts, the circle of her thoughts expanded and returned to Drake. She shoved, and it returned. She counted to herself. She recited the names of the objects in her field of vision. She cried, "No, no, no," and it returned. It kept returning. Drake had lied to her. It had been a plausible story. It would have held good under most circumstances, but Drake was not a biologist. Cancer could not be, as Drake had said, a disease that was an expression of a lost ability for normal growth. Cancer attacked children while they were still growing. It could even attack embryonic tissue. It attacked fish, which, like extraterrestrials, never stopped growing while they lived, and died only by disease or accident. It attacked plants, which had no minds and could not be parasitized. Cancer had nothing to do with the presence or absence of normal growth. It was the general disease of life to which no tissue of no multicellular organism was completely immune. He should not have bothered lying. He should not have allowed some obscure sentimental weakness to persuade him to avoid the necessity of killing her in that manner. She would tell them at the Institute. The parasite could be beaten. Its absence would not cause cancer. But who would believe her? She put her hands over her eyes. The young men who disappeared were usually in the first year of their marriage. Whatever the process of reproduction of the parasite intelligences, it must involve close association with another parasite, the type of close and continuous association that might only be possible if their respective hosts were in equally close relationship, as in the case of newly married couples. She could feel her thoughts slowly disconnect. They would be coming to her. They would be saying, "Where is Hargtholen?" And she would answer, "With my husband." Only they would say, "Where is your husband?" because he would be gone too. He needed her no longer. He would never return. They would never find him because he would be out in space. She would report them both, Drake Smollett and Hargtholen, to the Missing Persons Bureau. She wanted to weep, but couldn't. She was dry-eyed, and it was painful. And then she began to giggle and couldn't stop. It was very funny. She had looked for the answers to so many questions and had found them all. She had even found the answer to the question she thought had no bearing on the subject. She had finally learned why Drake had married her.
End of Hostess, audiobook, by Isaac Asimov, read by Fred Major. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe for more content.